Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about good and evil and its relationship with power. Now, this is something that sweeps in and around the sort of the woke, ideological, gender studies, sociology type, social justice understanding of the world at the moment, or certainly what they're trying to impose on the world. And that is that good and evil is fluid, a bit like gender and things like that is fluid, that it's determined through power relationships. So whoever has the power can make the definitions, and therefore the definitions are related to the power of those that make those, and the rest of us have to live by. So the definitions are that I don't know, say that being gay or lesbian is somehow an affliction, and that's determined, and that affliction is bad, and to remedy is good. Therefore, but to be able to impose and act on that definition and determination, one must have power. If you have no power, you can't do it. So the idea is that the people who have the power are evil, and therefore they're imposing their evilness on the rest of us, or on select minority groups, more to the point here, and that those definitions of good and evil are therefore illegitimate. Now, the idea is that every definition of good and evil is illegitimate because it's all imposed by people who have the power to impose it. Now, the power can be that you control the printing presses, or you control the distribution networks that distribute, books, the Bible, or anything around, or you control the media, or you control the institutions of learning, and so on and so forth. So on this basis, those who have the power can put those, can impose their views of good and evil, or right and wrong, call it what you like. And at the moment there's power, then it's illegitimate. Now, once that power is dispersed across multiple groups, then it is legitimate, or can be made to be legitimate. And they get a bit fuzzy on this. They're quite, the activists are quite clear. Well, all the definitions of right and wrong, at least in the Western world, are determined by white people, because the white people, particularly white men, had the power, and because it's white men, because they're therefore their determinations are all illegitimate, because it's white men, whiteness, white supremacy, Nazi, Hitler. So this is all a bit vague and sort of fuzzy, but it's all bad just because white men are associated with it. Okay. Now, a lot of this comes back to the religion thing, and I've talked about this before, that the Christian church was often opposed to, say, Judaism, particularly the Jews that wanted to live traditional lives, the kosher food and all that sort of stuff, and live very Jewish lives, very Jewish habits, Jewish cuisine, Jews marrying each other and only hiring each other and things like that, and money lending to Christian businesses and then taking them over when the extortionate interest rates, or usury as they used to call it, were charged. So the Catholic Church had its relationship with Judaism wasn't one that was close and cozy, and therefore to the Jewish way of thinking, and they if anything being very diligent and conscientious recorders of all the wrongs, cataloguers of all the wrongs that they believe have been inflicted on them, which always has them as the victim and the other people as the bad guys, the Gentiles as the bad guys. So the view from the Jewish activist machine is always at the pinnacle of any social activism at all levels, whether it be gay, lesbian, would be black, whether it be whatever, certainly through the education institutions. So this idea that, and I do, by the way, I think the Catholic Church was very heavy-handed in their treatment of Jews. I would have taken exception to it, but nonetheless, the definition of right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil, has very much been determined, certainly in the Western world, through the Christian traditions of, well, not simply Catholicism, but going into the Protestant religion and so on. So it didn't have to be the Catholic thing. Now, the view, therefore, is that given particularly since the Enlightenment and so on, and the Industrial Age, white people have pretty much been, white Christians have been deciding and laying down, to a large extent, the moral framework for what right and wrong is. And this has been viewed as it's been sort of patriarchal in the sense that the man must take the responsibility. But so according to the social justice activists, and particularly the globalist activists today, that really need to remove what they would see as obstacles to imposing the globalist ideology, is, and from the Jewish activist point of view, the Gentile Christian framing of good and evil is something that they think, the Jews think, worked and militated against them and against the Jewish tribalism and against the Jewish religion and Jewish customs and habits. So that framing of right and wrong is not consistent with Jewish values, even though there are crossovers, Elijah ascending unto heaven, all this sort of stuff. But nonetheless, so they would see that their Jewish persecution of the Jews relates back to the definitions of good and evil as laid down by Christian Gentiles who are white. Now, in terms of black activism, which crosses over into Marxism, very much so actually, then that framing of good and evil and right and wrong within the overall architecture of good and evil is seen as something that casts non-white people as being inferior. Now, that's not quite true. If you're looking at strictly racism, skin color only and nothing else, I think you'd struggle to find racism. If you're looking at behavioral differences, and those behaviors came from non-white societies, and therefore the treatment or the different treatment, then you would see what today we would try and, or the activists at least, would try and put together as racism. So this idea of framing black and brown people in a different or to view them through the lens of right and wrong as determined by white people through Christianity, then this is seen as casting these people as inferior in some way, whether it be in some moral context or some other behavioral context. Now, you notice this with the writings, say, of the first traders that were going, as in trading in spices and so on, that were going to places like India and the islands around Indonesia and things like that. The first traders, they were stunned at how duplicitous the Indian traders were, the Indian people were to do business with. They were quite surprised. You sign a contract and things like contract law, you honour the contract because that's what you agreed. That was perceived very much as a Christian way of looking at the world. You reach agreement, you sign the agreement, you shake hands, and everyone's good to go. And if each party honours their obligations as per the agreement, then it's fine. But the Europeans were stunned that the Orientals, as they called them generically, thought that an agreement, as in signing the contract, that was just one step in the negotiation, and that you would negotiate right up to the final nanosecond before the money changed hands or the goods changed hands. And this was something the Europeans just couldn't grasp. Now, this meant that the European moral code of behaviour, in this case signing the contract and meeting the obligations of the contract, that was something that was imposed by Europeans based on the European concept of right and wrong. To the Orientals, it was, so I signed a contract, so what? Yet this was seen as evil backsliding by the Europeans if the contract wasn't honoured. So there are certain attitudes and interpretations, customs and habits that permeated the interactions. But ultimately, it was the Europeans that had the cannons and had the technology, or the advanced technology, and had the capacity to impose their view of right and wrong. So this today, by the rest of the world, is seen, and by the globalists, the globalists have to get rid of the straight white male, Christian view of right and wrong, good and evil. They've got to get rid of it because it's an obstacle to imposing globalization, which is an exercise in mass relativism. And so they've got to get rid of that, which is why Christians and straight white males are so viciously attacked by the globalists, using the foot soldiers of the race, gender hustlers and transgender activists and so on. They're just the useful foot soldiers. As soon as the globalists impose their power, that these people, the race, gender hustlers and so on, they'll just be getting in the way. Wouldn't be surprised they're all taken it back and shot when the day comes, because they'll be that useless to them at that point. Those silly, useless fools, they don't realise how they're being used. Anyway, coming back to this concept of good and evil. So because it's a clear delineation of right and wrong and acceptable behaviour, unacceptable behaviour, and again, within that wider architecture, good and evil, then it's seen as a white construct that must be got rid of. And because it was conceived by whites and it didn't, the interpretation, definition of good and evil, for example, trading with the Orientals, they say, well, why should we honour the contract? So we signed it. Who gives a fuck? That is the relativism. Well, what's wrong with their view? Why does signing a contract and agreeing to terms and conditions? Why should that bind you to anything? That sort of thing. And so now I can look at it. Well, if you agree to something, then isn't that in itself the why would you then backslide and renege on the agreement? Surely that's wrong. But this is not the material point. The material point is, well, you're a white guy. You imposed it on them. Your definition was the one that applied. Therefore, it must be wrong. So it's quite a fuzzy type thing. That if you have power and the definitions of right and wrong, good and evil are consistent with the power you can impose, then therefore that definition is no longer legitimate because it came with power. So this is very much the path they go down, but they don't replace it with something. They don't say, well, this is the definition now of good and evil, but it's all relative, and it's all now, given that in the universities and the like, the social justice, warrior hustlers have the power, then isn't their definition of right and wrong also legitimate? Well, no, it isn't, because we have a white guy and a lesbian and a brown trans person. Therefore, our definition is legitimate because they agreed to it. Well, no, they don't. They ideologically agree to it because it suits their position as being unable to compete in a merit society. That doesn't make it right or wrong. And it's just your power that's now imposing that on the rest of it. So you could have a ridiculous situation where right and wrong didn't exist. In other words, utter moral anarchy. And you wonder whether you're heading to that. Some of the things that used to intrigue me with the communist societies, whether it be the Soviet Union following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, or whether it was the 1949 Chinese Revolution, Communist Revolution, and Pol Pot in Cambodia, and all that, Eastern Europe and so on, all those sorts of things, was how the entire political the entire police force became sort of political, as it is much now in the West, by the way. It became it wasn't police to combat crime or murder or robbery or something. It was a political police. It was to enforce and implement ideology and to try and kill off those that weren't fully on board with the ideology. It was so people could be arbitrarily arrested, they could be detained without trial, they could be tortured and beaten, they could be sent to work camps in the middle of fucking nowhere. They could suffer very considerable privation, all arbitrarily at the state, because they were ideological enemies. But people that were committing murder or this sort of thing, hate that. So you had these interesting things in the cities of the Soviet Union where there were the mean streets where people were being murdered and beaten and robbed and these sorts of things. But the police didn't really care. Why should we send police over there? Why should we have police officers running around there? I mean, who cares really? But if you borrow the wrong book from the library, something about, I don't know, Shakespeare, then straight away you're morally and politically suspect. You could be a counter-revolutionary. You could be an enemy of the people, and they can arbitrarily arrest you and interrogate you, beat you up and torture you and all sorts of shit just because you took out the wrong book. But if you murdered somebody, yeah, okay, who cares? So the ideological politicization of policing, now it did turn sort of full circle over time, where by the 1970s, people could take things to court, like the next door neighbour dumped rubbish in their front yard or something like that. So those sort of petty sessions court cases did start to occur. But for a while there, the idea that the police were all ideological. Crimes against property couldn't really occur because there was no private property anymore. Now, if you sabotaged a factory, for example, then it wasn't that you destroyed property. That wasn't the issue. It's that you were now an enemy of the people because the people owned that and you were destroying that. Therefore, you're an enemy of the people, and so on. So when we come to, and whether you're looking at Nietzsche or any of the philosophers, or we're even going back as far as Plato, for example, said that if you're a political leader and you're of sufficient sophistication, you're allowed to tell lies because you're that sophisticated. You can understand that the reason behind telling lies is justified, and therefore it's right and it's good. So you can have these moral sort of considerations going back to Plato, Seneca, Cicero, and people were thinking about this thousands of years ago. It's not something that's recent. Or even you look at the verses of Omar Khayyam and the Rubaiyat, a medieval Persian philosopher. You can even see the struggling with what is good and evil and how to define it. And it's still a discussion being happened today. The difference today is if it's associated with white people having power, then it's all thrown out as illegitimate. Whereas I think the definitions of good and evil and right and wrong that came from the Enlightenment, because it was evidence-based, particularly so, then I think those definitions overall and collectively are the closest definitions we've ever achieved as the human race has ever achieved in understanding right and wrong and framing laws around them. And now we're in danger of losing all of that. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.